Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, the channel where we dissect the darkest chapters of human history to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it reveals about the battlefield inside the human mind. I am glad you are here today because what we are about to discuss is not easy. It is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Today, we are going inside one of the most devastating and psychologically disturbing events of the 20th century. A genocide that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people. Most estimates settle around 800,000 in just 100 days. That is roughly 8,000 people murdered every single day. 333 people every hour. 5 people every single minute for 3 months straight. Let those numbers sit with you for a moment. We are talking about Rwanda, April 1994. And the most chilling part of this story is not the scale, it is not even the speed. It is the intimacy of it. These were not soldiers killing soldiers on a distant battlefield. These were neighbors killing neighbors, colleagues killing colleagues. In some cases, friends killing friends. People who had shared meals, attended the same churches, watched their children grow up together, picking up machetes and ending each other's lives. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of what turns ordinary human beings into killers. And this is the story of a world that watched and did almost nothing. To understand what happened in April 1994, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to a time before Rwanda as a modern nation even existed. Because the roots of this genocide were planted long before any living person in 1994 was even born. Rwanda sits in Central Africa, a landlocked country of rolling green hills, often called the Land of 1,000 Hills. Long before European colonizers arrived, Rwanda was home to a complex functioning society. The people who lived there broadly belonged to 3 groups, the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Twa. Now, here is something crucial that most people misunderstand. These were not rigid, ancient ethnic tribes with centuries of blood-soaked hatred between them. For much of Rwanda's pre-colonial history, Hutu and Tutsi were more like social or occupational classifications. Hutu were generally farmers. Tutsi were generally cattle herders. And in the fluid social structure of the time, it was actually possible for a person to shift from one category to another through wealth or marriage or circumstance. They spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda. They practiced the same faiths. They lived in the same communities. There was tension at times as exists between any social groups, but the catastrophic genocidal hatred that would come later, that was not ancient. That was manufactured. Germany colonized Rwanda in the late 1800s as part of the broader scramble for Africa. Then, after Germany's defeat in World War I, Belgium took control of the territory in 1916. And what the Belgians did over the next several decades would set in motion a chain of events that would end in rivers of blood nearly a century later. The Belgians arrived with a theory, a racist, pseudoscientific theory that was common among European colonizers of the era. It was called the Hamitic hypothesis, and it essentially argued that any sign of civilization or intelligence found among African peoples must have come from outside Africa, specifically from a more European-like people who had migrated from somewhere else. When Belgians looked at Rwanda, they decided the Tutsi, who tended to be taller and have slightly different physical features, must be this superior group. They believed the Tutsi were racially closer to Europeans, more intelligent, more capable of leadership. So the Belgians elevated the Tutsi. They gave Tutsi chiefs more power. They channeled education and administrative roles through Tutsi intermediaries. They built a colonial hierarchy on top of an existing social one and hardened it into something it had never been before, a racial identity. And then in 1933 they did something that would prove catastrophic. They issued identity cards to every Rwandan, and on those cards they stamped ethnicity, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, permanently, officially, unchangeably. What had once been a fluid social category was now a fixed racial label, documented and enforced by a colonial government. You were born Hutu, you would die Hutu. You were born Tutsi, you would die Tutsi. The Belgians had taken a society with complexity and nuance and flattened it into a racial hierarchy. They had handed power to one group and humiliated the other. And in doing so, they had planted seeds of resentment that would take decades to bloom, but bloom they would. As the mid-20th century arrived and independence movements swept across Africa, Rwanda's political landscape began to shift dramatically. The Hutu majority, long excluded from power under Belgian-backed Tutsi dominance, began to organize and push back. Hutu political leaders started framing their movement in racial terms: Hutu power, Hutu liberation, the restoration of what they called the rightful majority rule. In 1959, before formal independence, Rwanda exploded into violence. Hutu mobs attacked Tutsi families. Thousands of Tutsi were killed. Tens of thousands fled to neighboring countries, Uganda, Burundi, Congo. This period became known as the Social Revolution, and it fundamentally changed the power structure. When Rwanda formally gained independence from Belgium in 1962, it was under Hutu-led government. The Belgians, who had spent decades propping up Tutsi supremacy, now switched sides almost casually, supporting Hutu independence. And with that, a colonial wound was left open and untreated, not healed, not reconciled, just handed off to a newly independent nation already fractured along racial lines the colonizers themselves had drawn. The decades that followed were marked by repeated cycles of anti-Tutsi violence, political exclusion, and waves of refugees fleeing across Rwanda's borders. By the late 1980s, there was a massive diaspora of Tutsi exiles living in Uganda and other neighboring countries. Many of them had never even seen Rwanda. They had been born in exile, raised on stories of a homeland they had never visited. And among these exiles, a rebel organization was forming. It was called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. Led by a man named Paul Kagame, the RPF was composed largely of Tutsi exiles who had, ironically, gained military experience fighting in Uganda's civil war under Yoweri Museveni. In October 1990, the RPF invaded Rwanda from Uganda, triggering a civil war. This invasion, for the ruling Hutu government under President Juvenal Habyarimana, became the justification for something even more sinister than war. It became the justification for genocide. Hutu extremists within the government began framing all Tutsi inside Rwanda, not just RPF fighters, as a fifth column, as enemy collaborators, as inyenzi. That word, inyenzi, means cockroaches. And when a government starts calling a group of its own people cockroaches, history tells us where that road leads. Through the early 1990s, while peace negotiations were happening on the surface, something very dark was being built underneath. Hutu extremist groups, particularly a youth militia called the Interahamwe, which translates roughly to those who attack together, were being trained, organized, and armed. Machetes were being imported into Rwanda in quantities that made no sense for agricultural purposes. Lists were being drawn up. Radio stations were being prepared. And here is the part that must make every person of conscience stop and feel the weight of what is possible when institutions designed to protect people are weaponized against them. The radio. Specifically, a station called Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, or RTLM. This was not a neutral broadcaster. This was a propaganda machine operating in the language of genocide. RTLM broadcast 24 hours a day. It played popular music. It had charismatic hosts. People liked it. People listened to it the way you might listen to a favorite station on your morning commute. And between the music and the humor, it was pumping out a relentless message. Tutsi are your enemies. Tutsi are cockroaches. Tutsi are going to destroy you if you do not destroy them first. It named names, actual names. It gave addresses. It directed killers toward specific targets. This was industrialized incitement, and it worked. By early 1994, a peace agreement called the Arusha Accords had been signed between the Rwandan government and the RPF, theoretically ending the civil war and laying out a power-sharing arrangement. Hutu extremists within the government despised it. They saw it as a betrayal. They had no intention of honoring it. And then the trigger came. On the evening of April 6, 1994, President Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot down as it approached Kigali Airport. He was returning from peace talks in Tanzania. The plane went down in flames. Everyone aboard was killed. To this day, who actually fired the missile remains disputed. Some investigations point to Hutu extremists within the government who wanted a pretext for genocide and saw Habyarimana's peace commitments as a betrayal. Other accounts point fingers at the RPF. The truth of that particular night has never been fully settled with certainty. But here is what we do know with absolute certainty. Within hours of the plane going down, the killing had already begun. That speed alone tells you everything. Roadblocks were up within the first hour. Lists were being read. Politicians and moderate Hutu leaders who might have slowed the violence were being hunted and killed within the first night. This was not a spontaneous reaction to grief and anger. This was a plan that had been waiting for a signal. The plane crash was that signal. Prime Minister Agathe Uwilingiyimana, a moderate Hutu woman who represented everything the extremists feared, was among the first to be targeted. She was killed on April 7. The 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers assigned to protect her were captured, tortured, and murdered. That killing of the Belgian soldiers served a purpose. Within days, Belgium withdrew all of its remaining UN forces from Rwanda. The calculation had been correct. Kill some Europeans and the West will run. And run they did. What unfolded over the next 100 days defies easy description. The scale of organized killing, the speed of it, the intimacy of it, it challenges everything we think we understand about human nature. The Interahamwe moved through villages. RTLM broadcast instructions. Roadblocks were set up across the country where identity cards were checked. If your card said Tutsi, you did not pass. In areas without Tutsi, neighbors pointed out who had a Tutsi parent or a Tutsi spouse, or simply looked more like a Tutsi in the eyes of someone who wanted an excuse. Churches became killing grounds. This is one of the most haunting dimensions of the genocide, and it must be handled with care and honesty. Rwanda was, and is, a deeply Christian country. Church attendance was high. And when the killings began, thousands of Tutsi civilians did exactly what you or I might do in a moment of desperation. They sought sanctuary. They ran to churches, to hospitals, to schools, places that felt like safety. In some cases, they found it. There are accounts of courageous Rwandans, Hutu individuals who risked their own lives to hide Tutsi neighbors, smuggle them to safety, refuse the orders of the mob. These are the stories that remind us humanity never completely disappears, even in the darkest moments. But in many cases, the churches became massacre sites. In Ntarama, in Nyamata, in Nyang, thousands took refuge, and thousands were slaughtered. At some sites, local officials and clergy who collaborated with the killers even helped lure people in under false promises of safety. The betrayal of that, the weaponization of the sacred space, is something survivors have described as almost more devastating than the violence itself. In Nyamata, approximately 10,000 people were killed inside and around the church. Today it stands as a memorial. The bones of the victims remain inside. The blood-stained clothes hang on the pews. It exists so the world cannot pretend it did not happen. One of the most psychologically disturbing questions that historians, psychologists, and philosophers have wrestled with in the decades since is the one that lives at the heart of this documentary's title. How do neighbors become killers? Because that is genuinely what happened. This was not an army of professional killers parachuted in from somewhere else. The perpetrators were, in enormous numbers, ordinary people, farmers, teachers, local administrators, people who had, the week before, said good morning to the same families they were now hunting. Research done after the genocide has produced some deeply uncomfortable findings. Psychologists and sociologists who studied the Rwandan case found patterns consistent with what we know about ordinary people and extraordinary violence: obedience to authority, social conformity, dehumanization over time, fear, peer pressure, and in some cases, genuine, cultivated hatred that had been built over years by propaganda. The concept of dehumanization is key. When RTLM called Tutsi cockroaches and snakes for years before April 1994, it was doing something specific and deliberate to the minds of its listeners. Psychologists know that it is very difficult for most people to kill another human being who they perceive as fully human. The history of genocide consistently shows that before mass killing begins, there is always a prolonged process of stripping the target group of their humanity in the minds of the majority. They are made into vermin, into diseases, into existential threats. By April 1994, years of this propaganda had done its work on enough people. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. Enough people who would swing a machete, enough people who would point at a neighbor and say they are hiding in the sorghum field, enough people who would stand at a roadblock and make the decision. Researchers have also noted the role of community pressure and fear. In some cases, individuals who refused to participate in killings were themselves threatened or killed. The social pressure to conform to the violence was immense. Some who participated later told investigators they had been afraid of what would happen to them if they refused. This does not excuse what they did, but it helps explain how a society can fracture so completely, so fast. There is also the factor of prior grievance, real and manufactured. Decades of political exclusion, economic inequality, propaganda that told Hutu Rwandans that Tutsi people were an enemy within, that the RPF invasion proved Tutsi wanted to subjugate them again. All of this created a psychological environment where violence could feel, to those committing it, like self-defense. That is perhaps the most terrifying thing propaganda can do. It can make murder feel like survival. While Rwanda burned, the world watched and calculated. This is the chapter of the story that leaders of the most powerful nations on earth have since expressed the deepest regret about, though critics argue that regret came far too cheap. The United Nations had peacekeepers in Rwanda when the genocide began. They were commanded by a Canadian general, Dallaire. Before the genocide started, Dallaire had received intelligence about the weapons caches, the lists, the preparation for mass killing. He sent what became known as the genocide fax to UN headquarters in New York in January 1994, warning of the plan and requesting permission to act. He was told to stand down. He was told the UN mandate did not allow offensive action. He was told to report the intelligence to the Rwandan government, the very government that was planning the genocide. When the killing began, rather than reinforce Dallaire's force, the United Nations pulled troops out. The Security Council actually voted to reduce the UN mission in Rwanda from 2,500 troops to 270 in the early days of the genocide. Dallaire, left with a skeleton force, did everything he humanly could. His troops protected tens of thousands of civilians in designated safe zones. But he was fighting the math of mass murder with inadequate resources and inadequate mandate. The United States, still reeling from the catastrophe of Somalia in 1993, where American soldiers had been killed and dragged through Mogadishu streets, had no appetite for another African intervention. The Clinton administration made a deliberate decision to avoid using the word genocide in official communications, because once you call it genocide, international law and moral logic demand action. Clinton would later call this one of the greatest regrets of his presidency. France's role during this period remains one of the most contested and painful aspects of the international story. France had been a close ally of the Habyarimana government for years, providing military and political support. French officials have been accused of having prior knowledge of genocide planning and of continuing to support the Hutu government even as the killing unfolded. In 1994, France launched Operation Turquoise, ostensibly a humanitarian mission. Critics, including many survivors, have argued that its primary effect was to protect fleeing Hutu extremists and extend the life of the genocidal government, not to save Tutsi lives. Belgium withdrew after its soldiers were killed. The U.S. stayed away. France's actions remain a source of deep ongoing debate and diplomatic tension with Rwanda, and 800,000 people died in 100 days. Romeo Dallaire later wrote a book about his experience. He called it Shake Hands with the Devil. He suffered severe post-traumatic stress disorder for years afterward. He has said he saw the devil in Rwanda, not in any theological sense, but in the most raw and human sense. He saw what people can do to each other when the world decides to look away. The genocide ended not because the international community intervened, but because the RPF won the war. By July 1994, RPF forces had swept across Rwanda and taken Kigali. The genocidal government collapsed and fled into neighboring Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, along with approximately 2 million Hutu civilians who feared RPF reprisals, creating one of the largest refugee crises of that era. Paul Kagame's RPF established a new government. Kagame himself would become Rwanda's president, a position he continues to hold today. Rwanda's political story since 1994 is itself complex. Economic growth and reconciliation programs coexist with accounts of authoritarian governance and suppression of political opposition. But that is a story for another day. What matters for today's story is what the aftermath of April through July 1994 looked like on the ground. Rwanda was a country with mass graves in its schoolyards, with bodies in its rivers, with churches full of bones, with hundreds of thousands of orphans, with a justice system that had been decimated. Many of the judges and lawyers were dead or had fled, with a population that was simultaneously survivor, witness, and in many cases perpetrator. The question of justice after genocide is one of the most complex challenges humanity has ever attempted. Rwanda attempted something extraordinary. They had hundreds of thousands of people accused of participating in genocide, far too many to process through a conventional court system. The formal international court, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or ICTR, based in Arusha, Tanzania, prosecuted some of the high-level architects. But it was expensive, slow, and remote from Rwanda itself. For the mass of lower-level perpetrators, Rwanda revived a traditional community justice system called Gacaca, a Kinyarwanda word that refers to communal gathering on the grass. Under Gacaca, locally elected judges, not lawyers, but community figures, heard cases at the community level. Perpetrators could confess, provide information about what happened, and show remorse in exchange for reduced sentences. Survivors would speak. Communities would hear. Justice would be negotiated in public, in the open, in the very communities where the killing had happened. Over nearly a decade, Gacaca courts processed approximately 1.9 million cases. It was imperfect. Some convictions were unjust. Some perpetrators escaped accountability. Some survivors felt the process minimized their suffering. But it was also remarkable. It brought a country face to face with its own recent history in a way that conventional justice systems never could have managed. Today, Rwanda officially discourages the use of Hutu and Tutsi as identity markers. Ethnicity was removed from national identity cards. The official government position is that there are no Hutu or Tutsi, only Rwandans. Critics argue this suppresses legitimate discourse about identity and accountability. Supporters argue it is a necessary step toward building a unified national identity. Every April, Rwanda observes 100 days of national mourning, Kwibuka, which means to remember. Candles are lit. Names are read. The country stops and remembers, not just as an act of grief, but as a collective declaration. This will not happen again. We will not let the world forget. We will not forget ourselves. So what do we take from this? What does the Rwandan genocide teach us about the battlefield that exists not outside us, but inside the human mind. It teaches us that hatred is manufactured, not born. The Hutu and Tutsi of pre-colonial Rwanda were not destined for genocide. That destiny was written by colonial powers who needed division to rule. It was written by politicians who needed an enemy to consolidate power. It was written by broadcasters who found that fear and dehumanization were more profitable than truth. The lesson is not that people are inherently monstrous. The lesson is that ordinary people can be led to monstrosity through sustained, deliberate manipulation of identity, fear, and grievance. It teaches us that identity, when hardened into a weapon, becomes one of the most dangerous forces on Earth. When a government tells you that the most important thing about you is which group you belong to, and that another group is your existential threat, run from that government. Because that sentence has only ever ended one way. It teaches us that institutions matter, and their failure is catastrophic. The United Nations, the United States, France, Belgium, each of these institutions and governments failed Rwanda in 1994. They failed because of political calculation, because of institutional inertia, because of a world order that decided African lives were an acceptable trade-off for avoiding difficult decisions. And 800,000 people paid for those calculations with their lives. It teaches us that individual courage matters even when systems fail. Romeo Dallaire refusing to abandon Rwanda even as his government pulled troops out. Rwandan civilians who hid their neighbors in ceilings and fields and underneath floorboards, risking death to protect another human life. Paul Rusesabagina, the hotel manager who sheltered over 1,200 people in the Hotel des Mille Collines, a story told in the film Hotel Rwanda. These individuals could not stop the genocide, but they saved lives, and they remind us that even inside a collapsing moral order, the choice to do right remains available to individuals. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it teaches us that this can happen again, that it has happened again in different places and in different forms, that the patterns of dehumanization, manufactured grievance, political manipulation, and institutional failure that produced Rwanda are not unique to Rwanda. They are patterns we should be able to recognize when we see them, because recognizing them is the first step to interrupting them. Rwanda today is a country of remarkable contradiction. Its capital, Kigali, is one of the cleanest, most organized cities in Africa. Its economy has grown substantially in the 3 decades since the genocide. It has made significant strides in areas like healthcare and education. Women hold a greater proportion of parliamentary seats in Rwanda than almost any other country on Earth, a direct consequence of the decimation of the male population in 1994 and the women who rebuilt the country in the aftermath. But the wounds run deep. The survivor generation carries trauma that does not simply heal with time. The perpetrator generation carries guilt that does not simply dissolve with confession. The children of both groups carry a weight they did not choose. And the question of how a society reconciles all of that, not just legally or politically, but psychologically and spiritually, is one Rwanda continues to navigate every single day. There is a Rwandan phrase, Ubuntu Ngumuntu Ngabintu. It is a Bantu philosophy common across many African cultures, and it means, roughly, I am because we are. My humanity is bound up in your humanity. When I diminish you, I diminish myself. When I destroy you, I destroy something of myself. The genocide was the annihilation of that philosophy. The rebuilding of Rwanda has been, in many ways, an attempt to return to it, imperfect, contested, politically complicated, but an attempt nonetheless. To the 800,000 who were killed in those 100 days, their names should be spoken. Their lives mattered. Each of them had a name, a family, a voice, a story that was silenced. They were not statistics. They were human beings who deserved to live. They deserved a world that would protect them, and the world failed them. What we owe them all these years later is memory. Honest, unflinching, uncomfortable memory. Not the kind that sanitizes history into a palatable lesson, but the kind that sits with the full weight of what happened and asks hard questions about how, and why, and who, and what we would have done. Because those questions are never entirely about the past. They are always also about the present. They are always also about now. That is the story of the Rwandan Genocide, a story of colonialism's long shadow, of manufactured hatred, of ordinary people and extraordinary horror, of institutional failure on a global scale, and of a country trying, against staggering odds, to find its way back to something like wholeness. This is exactly the kind of history we explore here on Neural Battlefields, not because history is comfortable, but because it is necessary. Because if we do not understand the mechanisms of how things go wrong, we are always one propaganda radio station, one identity card, one political calculation away from getting it very wrong again. If this documentary meant something to you, if it gave you something to think about, something to feel, or something to share with someone who needs to hear this story, then please take a moment to like this video. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach more people who might benefit from this kind of deep historical exploration. If you are new to Neural Battlefields, subscribe and join this community. We dig into history, psychology, warfare, power, and the full complexity of the human story. The parts that matter, the parts that are hard, and the parts that no one should be allowed to forget. And if you know someone who should hear this particular story, about Rwanda, about how neighbors became killers, about what humanity is capable of both at its worst and at its most courageously resistant, share this video with them. That act of sharing is itself a small act of remembrance. We will see you on the next battlefield.